Relax, everyone, my niece Madison said as she leaned back in her chair and lifted her wine glass with a little laugh. Aunt Eleanor wouldn't understand this conversation anyway. She's the poor aunt. The words drifted across the Thanksgiving table like harmless humor, and for a moment several people chuckled politely, the way families often do when someone says something awkward but no one wants to challenge it. I smiled too. I even reached forward and passed the bowl of cranberry sauce down the long oak table, as if nothing at all had happened. Because the one thing Madison Whitmore did not know, something no one at that table seemed to remember anymore, was that I quietly controlled every dollar of the $500,000 trust fund waiting in her name. My brother Robert's house looked exactly the same as it had every November for the past 30 years. The smell of roasted turkey filled the kitchen. Football murmured from the television in the den. The dining room table stretched almost the length of the room, polished until it reflected the warm light of the chandelier above us. Madison sat near the center like she belonged there, wearing a cream sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill and talking confidently about her graduate program in Boston. She had always been good at commanding attention. At 23, she already moved through conversations as if she owned the future. Everyone listened when she spoke. Everyone nodded when she laughed. And tonight she seemed especially comfortable pointing out how successful her life had become. The tech sector is exploding right now, she said, tapping the side of her wine glass thoughtfully. People who know where to invest are making serious money. She glanced down the table at me then, the way someone might glance at a distant relative they barely knew. Of course, she added with a light shrug. Not everyone has the chance to get into those circles. I simply folded my napkin neatly in my lap and kept listening. I had learned a long time ago that silence often reveals more than arguments ever could. The Whitmore family had always valued appearances. Success, education, reputation, those things mattered here. Madison understood that better than anyone. She talked easily about internships, venture capital firms, and colleagues who flew between New York and San Francisco as if it were nothing more than a commute. My brother looked proud. My sister-in-law nodded approvingly. Someone across the table asked Madison about her plans after graduation. She smiled confidently. Honestly, the sky's the limit, she said. With the right support system behind you, opportunities are everywhere. A few people clinked glasses in agreement. I noticed she never once looked directly at me when she said it. And why would she? In Madison's version of the family story, I was simply the quiet aunt who lived alone in a modest house 2 towns away. The aunt who brought homemade pies to holidays. The aunt who never talked about investments, promotions, or big plans. In other words, the aunt who hadn't made it. Madison lifted her fork again and laughed softly. You know, she said to the table, every family has one person who just never really figured out the game. Her eyes flickered toward me for the briefest second before she took a sip of wine. But that's okay. Not everyone is meant to win. The room stayed comfortable. No one challenged the comment. The turkey was carved. Plates were passed around. Conversation shifted toward football scores and travel plans. And I continued to smile quietly from my seat at the end of the table, because what Madison and everyone else sitting there didn't realize was that 15 years earlier, when her grandfather finalized the legal documents that would shape her financial future, he placed the responsibility for her trust fund into my hands alone. The conversation at the table moved on quickly, the way it always does during large family dinners. Someone asked Robert about the new addition to his office building. My sister-in-law began describing a renovation project in their kitchen. Madison continued speaking about her plans after graduate school, explaining how many opportunities existed in the technology world if a person surrounded themselves with the right investors and the right connections. I listened quietly and kept eating my turkey, noticing how easily confidence came to her. Madison had always believed the world was a ladder and that she was naturally meant to climb higher than most people. Perhaps she had learned that belief from the way everyone around her treated success as the only measure that mattered. The Whitmore family had always admired achievement. Promotions were celebrated. Expensive degrees were admired. New houses and new cars were discussed and detailed during every holiday gathering. Quiet lives, however, rarely drew attention. People who worked steadily and kept to themselves often disappeared into the background of the conversation. I had learned to accept that many years ago. Madison continued talking about venture capital firms in Boston, and the type of investors who were eager to support young entrepreneurs. My brother listened with clear pride on his face. He had worked very hard throughout his life, and Madison represented everything he believed success should look like. Confident, educated, ambitious. When she spoke about her plans to eventually start her own company, several relatives nodded with admiration. One cousin even joked that the rest of the family would soon be asking Madison for investment advice. Madison laughed easily at the idea. She enjoyed those moments when the room focused entirely on her. I took a slow sip of water and looked around the table. The same faces had gathered here every November for decades. Some had grown older. Some had grown quieter. But the rhythm of the holiday never changed. Someone always told the same stories about childhood snowstorms. Someone always brought too many desserts. And the conversation always circled around success and opportunity. Madison believed she had built her future completely on her own determination. That belief had shaped the way she saw people around her. Those who appeared powerful deserved admiration. Those who appeared ordinary did not deserve much attention. I had watched that attitude grow slowly over the years. It had started subtly when she was younger. Small comments about clothing brands. Careful observations about which neighborhoods people lived in. Questions about what kind of careers produced the highest salaries. At first it seemed like harmless curiosity, but over time the pattern became clearer. Madison had learned to sort people into quiet categories without realizing she was doing it. And somewhere along the way she had placed me firmly in the category of people who had never accomplished very much. The truth was that my life had simply followed a different path. I had never been interested in public success or impressive titles. I preferred order, patience, and responsibility. For more than 30 years, I worked in financial administration at a regional bank, where my job required careful attention to detail and absolute discretion. I handled trust accounts, estate planning documents, and investment oversight for families who valued stability more than publicity. It was not glamorous work, but it taught me something very important. Wealth is often quiet. The people who truly manage money rarely speak loudly about it. I finished my meal slowly and watched Madison explain another business concept to the relatives sitting closest to her. She sounded certain that the future would always unfold exactly as she expected. The confidence of youth can be powerful like that. What Madison did not yet understand was that the path beneath her success had been carefully protected long before she was old enough to recognize it. 15 years earlier, her grandfather had studied the legal papers on his desk with the same thoughtful patience that had built the Whitmore family savings over decades. He understood that money alone could not guarantee wisdom. That was why he had chosen someone he trusted completely to protect the financial foundation he was leaving behind. And the responsibility he assigned that afternoon had quietly shaped Madison's future ever since. After dinner, the table slowly shifted into that familiar rhythm that comes every Thanksgiving evening. Plates were cleared away, someone brought out pumpkin pie, and the television in the living room grew louder as the football game reached its final quarter. Madison moved easily through the room carrying her dessert plate, continuing the same conversation she had started at the table. She spoke about internships in Boston, about investors she had met during networking events, about how the right connections could open doors faster than most people realized. Several relatives listened with admiration, and I noticed how naturally she stepped into the center of every conversation. Confidence surrounded her like a well-tailored coat. At one point, she leaned against the kitchen counter while explaining how the financial world was changing. She said that people who understood money early would always stay ahead, while others spent their lives trying to catch up. I watched her speak with complete certainty, and I remembered another Thanksgiving many years earlier when she had been a quiet child sitting beside her mother at the same table. Back then she had asked simple questions about how banks worked and why people saved money for the future. Her curiosity had been genuine, almost sweet. The change had come slowly over the years as her education, her social circles, and her ambitions grew larger. Now her curiosity had turned into confidence, and that confidence had slowly turned into judgment. While Madison described the difference between old money and new investment strategies, my brother Robert poured himself another cup of coffee and nodded along proudly. He believed his daughter was destined for extraordinary success, and perhaps she was. Intelligence and ambition can carry a person very far in life. But experience had taught me that ambition alone does not always teach patience or humility. Madison continued speaking about financial independence as if she had discovered the concept herself. She explained how people needed strong financial guardians to guide them during the early stages of building wealth. The irony of the moment did not seem to occur to her. I quietly rinsed a dish in the sink and listened to the sound of her voice echo through the kitchen. The conversation eventually shifted toward her upcoming plans after graduation. Someone asked whether she intended to move permanently to Boston or if she might eventually settle somewhere else. Madison answered with the confidence of someone who believed the world would arrange itself around her goals. She said that the right opportunity would appear soon enough. That was when my sister-in-law casually mentioned the long-term financial support Madison had received from her grandfather's estate. The comment was brief and almost an afterthought, but it reminded me of the afternoon 15 years earlier when the final details of that estate had been decided. Madison had been 8 years old at the time, sitting on the front steps of the Whitmore house with a coloring book while the adults discussed legal papers inside. Her grandfather had built the family savings through careful planning, and he believed strongly that wealth should protect the next generation without weakening their character. That belief had guided every clause in the documents placed on the lawyer's desk that day. He wanted Madison to have opportunities that he never had as a young man. At the same time, he wanted someone responsible to guard the funds until Madison learned the value of patience and judgment. Several relatives had assumed that Robert would oversee the account. Others expected a professional trustee from the bank to manage it. But the old man had surprised everyone when he quietly slid the papers across the desk toward me. I still remember the calm seriousness in his voice as he explained his reasoning. He said that financial security required discipline and discretion, and that I possessed both qualities in a way he trusted completely. The responsibility he handed me that afternoon had never been discussed openly at family gatherings. It existed quietly in legal documents and annual statements that only a few people ever read carefully. Madison had grown up believing her future resources were simply part of the family legacy waiting patiently for her adulthood. She had never questioned who protected that legacy or who decided when the time would come for her to use it. The responsibility he placed in my hands that afternoon was not something I accepted lightly. When the lawyer finished explaining the documents, the room had grown quiet in the way serious rooms often do when everyone realizes an important decision has just been made. My brother Robert had looked surprised at first, but he trusted our father's judgment enough not to question it. The lawyer carefully outlined the structure of the trust fund, explaining how the money would be protected until Madison reached certain milestones in her life. Education would be supported. Living expenses could be approved when necessary. Larger distributions, however, would require careful evaluation to ensure the funds served Madison's long-term future rather than temporary impulses. As the appointed trustee, I would review those requests and determine whether they aligned with the purpose our father intended. I remember the weight of those words very clearly. Managing someone else's future is not the same as managing money alone. It requires patience, restraint, and the ability to see beyond the excitement of the present moment. Over the years that followed, the responsibility became part of the quiet rhythm of my life. Once every year, I reviewed the account statements, the investment growth, and the reports prepared by the financial firm that handled the portfolio. The balance grew steadily through conservative investments and careful oversight. What began as a substantial inheritance slowly expanded into something even more secure. Meanwhile, Madison grew from a curious child into the confident young woman sitting across the Thanksgiving table that evening. From a distance, I watched each stage of her life unfold. I approved payments for her private high school tuition when she was 14. I authorized funds for her summer academic programs when she was 16. Later, I reviewed the paperwork for her university expenses and signed the approvals that allowed her to attend one of the best graduate programs in the country. Every time I approved one of those requests, I thought about the conversation her grandfather and I had shared on that quiet afternoon years earlier. He had believed that financial support should open doors but never remove responsibility. The trust was designed to give Madison opportunity, not entitlement. That distinction mattered more to him than the number written on the balance sheet. Yet as Madison grew older, I noticed that opportunity had slowly transformed into expectation in her mind. The support she received had become invisible to her, like air in the room that no one notices because it is always there. She believed her success came entirely from her own effort and intelligence. Perhaps that belief made her stronger in some ways, but it also prevented her from recognizing the quiet network of care that had supported her journey from the beginning. Standing in my brother's kitchen that evening, I watched her continue explaining investment strategies to our relatives as if she had already mastered every lesson the financial world could offer. She spoke about markets rising and falling, about the importance of choosing the right partnerships, about how successful people recognized opportunity faster than others. Several people listened carefully, impressed by the confidence in her voice. I could not help noticing that the subject of patience never entered the conversation. Neither did humility. Those qualities rarely appear exciting when someone is 23 years old and the future appears wide open. I placed my coffee cup beside the sink and looked out the window into the dark backyard where the cold November air had settled over the lawn. The house behind me was filled with laughter and conversation, but my thoughts had drifted back to the quiet office where the trust documents still rested in a locked cabinet. Each signature on those papers carried the weight of intention. Madison would eventually gain full control of the funds when she demonstrated the maturity to manage them wisely. Until then, the responsibility remained with me, exactly as her grandfather had planned. And as I listened to her confident voice echo through the kitchen that evening, I began to wonder whether the lesson she needed most was one she had not yet learned. Later that evening, the house slowly settled into the quiet comfort that always follows a large holiday. Dinner. Dishes had been washed, leftovers were packed into containers, and most of the family gathered in the living room where the television cast a soft glow across the carpet. Madison remained the center of attention even there, sitting on the arm of a chair while explaining another story about one of her professors in Boston who had connections with venture capital firms on the West Coast. She described the kind of investors who moved millions of dollars between startups, the kind of deals that happened in conference rooms overlooking city skylines. The room listened with interest, and I noticed how easily admiration flowed toward confidence. People enjoy listening to certainty. It makes the future feel organized and predictable. Madison spoke with that same certainty now, describing the kind of business she hoped to start after graduation. She said the world was full of opportunities if someone had the courage to take them. She said the difference between successful people and everyone else was simply the willingness to act quickly when opportunity appeared. My brother Robert nodded proudly while he listened. For him, these moments were proof that his daughter had grown into the ambitious young woman he always believed she could become. The conversation eventually shifted toward money in a more practical sense, when one of Madison's cousins asked how someone new to investing should begin building wealth. Madison leaned forward thoughtfully and began explaining the importance of access. According to her, the most important advantage any person could have was early capital. She said that the right amount of financial support at the right moment could launch a career much faster than years of slow saving. Several people agreed with that observation. I quietly poured another cup of coffee and listened as Madison continued describing the types of investments she hoped to make someday. She spoke about technology companies, emerging markets, and the way new businesses could grow rapidly when the right funding arrived at the perfect time. Then she said something that caught my attention. She explained that the hardest part for many young entrepreneurs was convincing investors to trust them with large sums of money before they had proven themselves. She laughed lightly and said that once she had access to real capital, she would know exactly how to use it. The words floated through the living room without any sense of irony. Madison truly believed that the future resources waiting for her were simply tools that would appear when she decided she was ready to use them. The structure protecting those resources had never crossed her mind. She had never wondered who reviewed the paperwork each year or who ensured the investments continued growing quietly in the background. For her, the trust fund existed like a promise waiting patiently for her adulthood. As the evening continued, I watched the confidence in her voice and thought about the documents resting in the safe drawer of my office at home. Every clause had been written carefully. Every condition had been designed to encourage judgment rather than impulse. The trust was not simply a gift. It was a safeguard meant to guide her toward responsibility. I had honored that responsibility faithfully for more than a decade. I had approved expenses when they supported her education and declined requests that seemed unnecessary. Each decision followed the same principle her grandfather had explained years earlier. Opportunity should strengthen a person's character rather than replace it. Listening to Madison speak that evening, I began to wonder whether the time had come for her to learn how carefully those opportunities had been protected all along. The thought did not come from anger or resentment. It came from the quiet understanding that true responsibility sometimes requires honesty at the right moment. Madison continued speaking about the future as if the path ahead had already been guaranteed. And I realized that sooner or later she would need to understand who had been guarding that path the entire time. I left my brother Robert's house a little after 9 that evening. The cold November air felt sharp and quiet after the warmth and noise of the living room. And for a moment I stood beside my car looking up at the dark sky above the neighborhood. Thanksgiving had always been a loud holiday in our family, filled with laughter, stories, and the steady clatter of dishes from the kitchen. But as I drove home through the quiet streets, my thoughts stayed on the conversations I had heard that night. Madison's voice had carried through every room with the confidence of someone who believed she already understood how the world worked. She spoke about money the way young people sometimes do, as if wealth were simply a tool waiting for the bold enough to claim it. The idea that money also required patience, restraint, and careful judgment had not yet entered her understanding. When I reached my house, the porch light was still glowing softly over the front steps. My home was smaller than my brother's and much quieter, but I had always appreciated that quiet. Inside, the familiar scent of cedar from the old bookshelf greeted me as I hung my coat near the door. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at the small desk near the window where I handled most of my paperwork. The room was calm, the way it always felt after a long day when the world outside had finally slowed down. For a while I simply sat there thinking about the evening. Madison had not meant her comment as cruelty. That much was clear. To her it had been an easy joke, a casual observation about someone she assumed lived a very ordinary life. In many ways she was not wrong. My life had always been quiet. I had never chased recognition or prestige. The bank where I worked for more than 3 decades valued reliability more than attention, and that suited me perfectly. But quiet lives often carry responsibilities that are not visible from the outside. Eventually I reached into the drawer beside the desk and removed a small metal key. I walked across the room to the cabinet where I kept the documents that mattered most. Inside a locked compartment rested several neatly organized folders. One of them contained the trust records I had reviewed every year since Madison was a child. I placed the folder on the desk and opened it slowly. The pages inside were familiar to me now, each statement detailing the steady growth of the account over time. Careful investments had protected the original inheritance and allowed it to expand far beyond its initial value. The number printed at the bottom of the latest report was larger than the one I had seen just a year earlier. The trust fund had crossed the $500,000 mark months ago. I read through the documents again, just as I did every year, reviewing the conditions that governed how the funds could be distributed. The language was clear and deliberate. The trustee held full authority to approve or delay any request until the beneficiary demonstrated sound financial judgment. That clause had always seemed like a safeguard rather than a test. But tonight, for the first time in many years, I wondered whether the moment to apply it might eventually arrive. Madison believed success came from bold decisions and quick action. Her grandfather had believed something different. He believed wisdom came from patience and respect for the responsibility that wealth carries. As I closed the folder and returned it to the cabinet, I realized that Madison had reached the age where those lessons could no longer remain theoretical. The future she spoke about so confidently would soon bring choices that revealed what she truly understood about money, opportunity, and the people who had quietly supported her path all along. The following morning arrived quietly, the way early winter mornings often do when the air feels still and the sun rises slowly over the rooftops. I woke earlier than usual, not because anything urgent demanded my attention, but because my thoughts from the previous evening had not completely settled. The house remained silent as I moved through my usual routine, preparing coffee and opening the curtains in the living room to let the pale morning light fill the space. Outside, the neighborhood looked calm and ordinary. A few cars passed along the street. Somewhere down the block a dog barked briefly before everything returned to quiet again. I carried my coffee to the desk near the window and sat down, thinking again about the conversations from Thanksgiving dinner. Madison had spoken with such certainty about opportunity and success that it almost sounded like she believed the future would automatically reward her confidence. Youth often carries that kind of optimism. When people are young and ambitious, they tend to believe the world will move quickly in response to their ideas. But experience teaches something different. Opportunity does not simply appear because someone expects it. It appears because someone has prepared carefully for the responsibility that comes with it. As I thought about this, I opened my laptop and reviewed a few emails that had arrived overnight. Most of them were routine messages from the financial management firm responsible for maintaining the investment portfolio connected to the trust fund. Once every quarter, they sent an update describing market performance and the current balance of the account. I read through the report carefully, just as I had done many times before. The investments had performed steadily through the year, and the balance remained secure. The structure protecting those funds had been designed to withstand both opportunity and risk. That stability had always been the purpose of the trust. While I was finishing my coffee, my phone buzzed softly on the desk. I glanced down and noticed Madison's name appear on the screen. It was the first time she had contacted me directly in several months. For a moment, I simply watched the phone vibrate before answering. When I finally picked it up, Madison's voice sounded bright and energetic, exactly as it had the night before. She greeted me warmly and asked how I was doing after the holiday gathering. Then she explained that she had been thinking about something important and wanted to share an idea with me. I listened quietly as she began describing a business opportunity one of her classmates had recently introduced to her. According to Madison, a group of young entrepreneurs was launching a technology company that aimed to connect small businesses with new digital marketing tools. She said the project was gaining attention among several early investors, and she believed it had the potential to grow rapidly over the next few years. Her voice carried the same excitement I had heard during dinner. She explained that entering the investment early could create enormous returns once the company expanded. Then she paused briefly before continuing with a slightly more thoughtful tone. She said that opportunities like this often required initial funding from people who believed strongly in the vision behind the project. I understood immediately where the conversation was leading. Madison explained that she was exploring different ways to secure the capital necessary to participate in the venture. She mentioned personal savings, potential partners, and eventually the possibility of using financial resources connected to her future inheritance. As she spoke, I noticed that she never once questioned whether those resources might require careful approval. In her mind, they already belonged to her. She described the situation with calm confidence, explaining how she intended to move quickly once she gathered the necessary funds. I listened without interrupting, allowing her to finish outlining the opportunity she believed would launch her career forward. When she finally paused, waiting for my response, I realized that the moment her grandfather had anticipated years ago might finally be approaching. I did not answer Madison immediately. Instead, I leaned back slightly in my chair and looked out the window beside my desk while she waited on the other end of the phone. The neighborhood was fully awake now. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the house and sunlight reflected off the windshields of parked cars along the street. Madison continued speaking with the same steady confidence she had shown the night before, explaining that timing was everything in business and that the investors who moved early often gained the greatest advantage. She described the startup again, emphasizing the energy of the founders and the rapid growth potential they believed they had discovered. I listened carefully to every word. The enthusiasm in her voice reminded me of how people often feel when they stand at the beginning of something new. Possibility can be very persuasive when it arrives wrapped in optimism. When Madison finally paused, I asked a few calm questions about the proposal. I asked who had prepared the financial projections and whether the founders had already secured long-term contracts with any companies that might guarantee revenue. Madison answered confidently, though I noticed that several of her explanations relied more on excitement than on detailed planning. She said the team expected strong growth once the platform launched and that many successful businesses had started with the same kind of early momentum. Then she explained that entering the project early would require a significant financial commitment. The founders were looking for initial investors willing to contribute at least $150,000 to help expand development and marketing efforts. Madison spoke about the number as if it were simply a necessary step toward building something much larger. Her tone carried no hesitation. I asked her whether she had already secured that amount. There was a brief silence before she answered. She explained that she had saved some money from internships and scholarships, but that it would not be enough to meet the level required for a founding investment. That was when she mentioned the trust fund again, this time more directly. Madison said that the account had been established to support her future opportunities and that she believed this investment represented exactly the kind of opportunity her grandfather would have wanted her to pursue. She spoke with certainty, as though the conclusion had already been reached. From her perspective, the decision was simple. The funds existed to help her succeed, and success was waiting for her on the other side of this opportunity. I remained quiet for a moment before responding. I told her that investing in new companies can sometimes create great success, but it also requires careful evaluation. I asked whether she had reviewed the legal agreements or consulted with financial advisors about the potential risks. Madison replied that the founders were still preparing some of the documentation, but that early investors needed to move quickly before the opportunity closed. Speed, she said, was part of the advantage. I thanked her for explaining the situation so clearly and told her that decisions involving large financial commitments should always be reviewed carefully. I said that patience often protects opportunities better than urgency. Madison seemed slightly surprised by my cautious tone, but she remained polite. She explained that she understood the importance of planning and that she would send me additional details about the company once the founders finalized their proposal. After we ended the call, the room became quiet again. I set the phone down beside my coffee cup and considered everything Madison had said. Her excitement was genuine, but excitement alone had never been the purpose of the trust her grandfather created. The responsibility he had given me all those years earlier was not simply to release money when requested. My responsibility was to ensure that opportunities strengthened judgment rather than replacing it. And as I sat there reviewing the conversation we had just shared, I realized that Madison's request had begun to reveal exactly the kind of test her grandfather had anticipated. 3 days after our phone conversation, Madison sent the documents she had mentioned. The email arrived late in the evening while I was reviewing a few routine reports at my desk. The subject line simply read Startup Investment Proposal. I opened the message and began reading through the attached presentation slowly, the same way I had reviewed financial documents for most of my professional life. The proposal described a technology platform designed to help small businesses manage digital advertising more efficiently. The founders were young, energetic, and clearly enthusiastic about their idea. The slides were filled with confident language about rapid growth, expanding markets, and the possibility of becoming a leader in a developing industry. I continued reading carefully, studying the projections and financial assumptions behind their plan. Some sections showed thoughtful preparation, but others relied heavily on optimistic estimates rather than proven results. That was not unusual for early-stage ventures, but it was exactly the type of situation where careful judgment mattered most. By the time I reached the final page, I understood why Madison had been so excited. The idea had potential. At the same time, the risks were very real. I closed the laptop and sat quietly for a moment, thinking about the responsibility that had been placed in my hands all those years earlier. The trust fund existed to support Madison's future, but it had never been intended to follow every impulse that appeared promising in the moment. Her grandfather believed strongly that financial security should protect opportunity rather than gamble on it. The following afternoon, Madison called again, eager to hear my thoughts. Her voice carried the same hopeful energy as before. She explained that the founders were already speaking with several other potential investors, and that early participation would secure a much stronger ownership position. She asked whether I had reviewed the materials she sent. I told her that I had read everything carefully. Then I explained my perspective as calmly as possible. I said the concept behind the company was interesting and that entrepreneurship often begins with ambitious ideas. At the same time, I explained that responsible investing requires more than enthusiasm. It requires proven planning, detailed financial accountability, and time to evaluate whether the opportunity truly supports long-term stability. Madison listened quietly while I spoke, though I could hear a hint of disappointment in the silence that followed. She reminded me that the trust fund existed to help her pursue opportunities exactly like this one. I acknowledged that she was correct about the purpose of the trust. Then I explained something she had never fully understood before. I told her that the trust was not a simple inheritance waiting to be unlocked. It was a structure built on responsibility and oversight. The funds could only be released when the investment demonstrated careful preparation and a level of maturity that protected her future rather than risking it. For a moment, there was complete silence on the line. Madison asked what that meant for her request. I told her honestly that based on the documents I had reviewed, the proposal required more development before it met the standards her grandfather had established. I explained that patience often creates better opportunities than rushing toward uncertain ones. Madison did not argue, but I could hear the surprise in her voice when she realized that the final decision truly rested with me. Before ending the call, I told her something that had remained unsaid for many years. I reminded her that success is not measured only by how quickly someone moves toward opportunity. It is measured by the wisdom they show in deciding which opportunities deserve their trust. After the conversation ended, I returned the documents to their folder and placed them back in the cabinet beside my desk. The responsibility I had accepted years earlier remained exactly where it belonged, protecting the future that Madison would one day understand far more clearly than she did today.